My name is Bob Liff, and this is the CUNY Forum, a town meeting that brings prominent New Yorkers together with faculty and students of the Edward T. Rogowski Internship Program in Government and Public Affairs. Elections have consequences, as we continue to learn every day since the second Trump administration began ripping apart long-respected domestic and international norms. Nowhere is that more clear than on immigration, where the beginnings of mass deportations are already taking place, and the administration is targeting and threatening localities and states like New York, where sanctuary for undocumented immigrants has been the hallmark for decades. CUNY is certainly not exempt, with large numbers of immigrant students, including upwards of 6,000 who are undocumented, but welcome to seek a quality education and a shot at the American dream. We're joined by 4 New Yorkers to talk about how Trump's shift in immigration policy could change life for CUNY's undocumented students and beyond, who are critical not only to our economy, but to who we are as a city and a nation. Dr. Cynthia Nayeli Carvajal is the director of CUNY's Undocumented and Immigrant Students Programs. Monique Francis is the interim executive director of CUNY's Citizenship Now program. Felipe de la Hoz is a lecturer in the NYU Journalism Department, co-founder of the Borderlines blog and an associate member of the Daily News editorial board. And Rosa Gomez is a student at Baruch College and a research fellow at the Undocumented Immigrant Students Program. Felipe, let me start with you. In the month plus that this administration, they have ripped apart a whole bunch of immigration norms. What's changed? What should we know about as we enter this discussion?
Sure. I think the first thing to understand is that in terms of immigration policy, I think it is the area of federal policy where the executive probably has the most power unilaterally and discretion. You know, Congress has really abdicated a lot of power to the president in this regard. There's a whole history here, stemming from Trump term 1 about things that they probably will do, have attempted to do. I think for our purposes, the most important changes that we've seen are the sort of end of prioritization when it comes to domestic immigration enforcement, wherein, the administration has essentially terminated categories that were high priority, you could say, for enforcement. Right now, it's sort of everybody, is kind of on the table. I would say also a lot of people have heard now about the end of the so-called sensitive locations policy, which enables ICE and CBP to some extent to now do operations in what were considered sensitive locations prior, hospitals, schools, places of worship, right? There's
schools
lawsuits,
meaning colleges as well.
Colleges as well. There's, litigation around that. We'll have to see how it plays out. And then I think, there's been some recent discussion also of this kind of new program that we haven't really seen the details about, but an attempt to sort of force the registration of every undocumented person over 14 years of age, kind of banked on a World War II era law. They haven't really released the regulations around that yet per se, so we have a little bit of data around how that will play out. And I think the other thing is kind of attempting to end sort of these administrative statuses that people can have, so things like temporary protected status, parole programs, and I think crucially for a big part of the undocumented population here at CUNY, DACA is almost certainly going to be targeted at some point. They tried to dissolve it in the first Trump administration.
Which is, DACA is Deferred Action for Children.
Childhood arrivals.
Childhood arrivals.
Childhood
yes.
arrivals.
2012 era program that has sort of been able to remain in place for this whole period of time. There was a federal judge during the first Trump term that essentially declared it illegal, but kept the program in place. Just no new applications, but so it still exists. I'm sure the administration will sort of try again to dissolve it, and so that's something that we're definitely gonna have to be on the lookout for.
Cynthia, give us a little bit of the lay of land at CUNY. I mean, we have, this city is what, 40% immigrant at large. I don't know what the numbers are at CUNY. I know that in our discussions, there were over 6,000 undocumented students at CUNY. Tell us, the universe of people we're dealing with.
Yeah, I'll put it in the scope of kind of starting at the state level. So New York State has the 4th largest undocumented population overall across the United States. With regards to cities, New York/New Jersey have the 3rd largest concentration. And so when we're looking at a university system that is meant for the New York City community, for immigrants, low-income students, so they're able to afford and attain higher education and social mobility, CUNY is uniquely positioned in welcoming and including and retaining these students. And so at the City University of New York, The numbers that have been shared is about 6,000 possible undocumented students across our university system, but 1/3 of our students have self-identified as immigrants. So it's a substantial population when you're looking at who could be impacted, not just directly impacted because they could be subject to deportation, but also that their families might be subject, their parents who are undocumented if they are US citizens, their friends, their neighbors. So we're really seeing an impact throughout the community, not just those who identify as undocumented.
In working with with the undocumented program, have you seen an increase in concern of students coming in? Are they expressing fear? Are they expressing anger?
Most are fair. I think what we are seeing right now with the ending of TPS and the potential ending of the TPS for Haiti and
That's
Venezuela,
temporary protected status.
for,
It's for
yeah.
Venezuelans.
And
Most
Haitians.
probably Haitians is the most. It affects us in the city the most.
Yeah, well, there are more Venezuelans than Haitians. I was shocked by that
Is that
number.
right? I didn't-
Yes. But in the system, we have more Haitian students. Yeah, so with the ending of those programs, what we're seeing right now is that people are trying to figure out, so what happens next? You know, if I don't have any status, what happens with my tuition? You know, am I going to lose financial aid? So that's those are the questions that we're getting.
Rosie, you are a student.
Yes.
I mean, what are your fellow students, and you work in this area, as a research fellow. Have you seen a change?
Yes, so as you mentioned, I'm a student. I'm also a research fellow, so that uniquely positions me to get a firsthand account of what
Yes.
students are saying, and then in my own research, what data I've gathered. The same concerns with what are we doing after we graduating, are still present regardless of the administration. There are certain concerns that students experience, and I've seen fear and fear-mongering being more prevalent now with this new administration. But students are still showing up, still going to school, still participating in activities. They're fully integrated into our community and school systems and are not being deterred by the uncertainty in policies.
Cynthia, what do you, do you spend time advising? There are a number of flyers that the mayor's office of immigrant affairs, a number of immigrant rights groups put out what to do if you are stopped by ICE. Immigration offenses are still civil and not criminal violations. What are you telling people?
So we actually rely on our partners at CUNY Citizenship now to share more about Know Your Rights. So having lawyers be able to advise students and explain what are their rights in instances where they may interact with ICE, whether they're in plain clothes or in uniform. But I think another layer of knowing your rights or knowing what legislation exists to protect this population is also clarifying to university administrators, to staff, faculty, and students that state laws are still in effect, no matter who the president is, right? So in the state of New York, we have in-state tuition legislation for anyone regardless of immigration status. We have access to state aid regardless of immigration status. And so it's by emphasizing that those state legislations still exist and that they still fall within the state jurisdiction that staff and administrators can more confidently advise undocumented and immigrant students that, yes, these are the benefits that you're able to access regardless of immigration status. This is how you can go to college, pay for college, graduate, and then through the resources that CUNY provides, also advise on what to do after you graduate.
So, what are you seeing in terms of the legal rights of students? Has there been an increase in questions? And stuff?
Yeah, so the right to remain silent, the right that you do not have to engage with ICE when they stop you. You do
Which
not
is a very
have to
difficult.
consent.
It's easier to say than to
Yeah,
do
but,
it when
you
you're in
know-
a confrontation on the street.
Yeah, but not consenting to them searching you and saying it loudly so at least people can hear you. So if there's litigation, you can say, I did express my right to remain silent. Because, a lot of things that are happening right now, that they're racially profiling black and brown people and stopping them on the subways, at Port Authority, those are things that are real for immigrant students.
There are distinct racist underpinnings, frankly, of this policy. It didn't go unnoticed that Trump said that he was interested in letting in white South Africans, even as he said that it's all these black and brown people from, pardon my saying so, old countries. That was his words that he used in the he wanted people from Norway, not from these other countries. That racism has been a hallmark of the Trump approach, and frankly, you go back to the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Birthright Citizenship Act, laws. This is a hallmark of the policy.
Sure. I mean, I think that the Trump administration hasn't even particularly subtle about sort of racial, and the whole DEI thing, which kind of is outside of a little bit of the scope of this conversation, but is an example of that focus.
Diversity, equity, and
is
inclusion.
A pretty obvious attempt to sort of reinstate, or kind of like glorify a certain kind of conception of the U.S. as sort of a white country or whatever. And they're pretty open about this. I don't think that's even really a controversial position. One thing I do also
it's controversial, but it's not in doubt.
I don't think it's arguable really
Right.
in good faith is what kind of what I mean. And I do want to say something also about the Know Your Rights stuff, which is that I think people have a sense that, but really what can I do? How does this even work? And we actually have seen examples of this working in practice. A few weeks ago there was a pretty big operation in Denver that involved ICE agents and sort of other federal agents that were detailed to this kind of, it was supposed to be like some kind of gang targeting thing, but that's what they always say. I mean, they just kind of rolled up
gang,
to,
was it? Right.
yeah, these apartment complexes and sort of were knocking on doors, and they didn't. They were able to arrest, I think, a couple of dozen people, but there were a lot of people that didn't open their doors, that didn't speak to the officers there, and eventually they sort of gave up on all the entire operation and left that area. And so these things work. I mean, at the end of the day, you do have these rights and you can exercise them, and I think that's just also something important to note, that it's not just it's not just kind of an invocation you can make that does nothing. Like these are sort of real things that exist and that can be defended in a court of law.
When you talk to your fellow students, do they talk about? Are they anticipating getting stopped? Are they planning for it? What's this idea that you can be stopped on the street? Does that cause concern?
I'll speak on my experience at Baruch College. We do have Immigrant Student Success Initiative. So there's part-time faculty who are taking on the job of educating students or compiling resources for them, and they are organizing workshops, Know Your Rights workshops, where they are handing out red cards that basically outline your rights, like the right to remain silent, so that they, if in the occasion that they are encountered by any authority that makes them uncomfortable, they can say, I have the right to remain silent, and just hand them that card. We're also equipping students with scenarios of, like, if they come knocking to your door, ask for a warrant, is it signed by a judge? Things of that nature are being done on campus at Baruch College, and similarly across CUNY campuses all over the 5 boroughs.
No, I don't know who would deal with this, but they're taking shots at birthright citizenship. The Supreme Court upheld right of anybody born within the United States, provided you're not a diplomat's kid, to automatic citizenship, and this goes back actually to the 1880s and 90s. There was a Chinese man born here, went back to China, and they tried to deny him re-entry, and that went to the Supreme Court, and they said no, if he was born here, he's a citizen. That's where, that's the underpinning, the legal underpinning, as I understand it, of birthright citizenship. But they're going after that. I mean, I don't know if anybody has any sense of to what degree. There are a lot of immigrant kids born here whose parents were not, and whose parents may be out of status.
I don't think I can speak to any numbers, because I'm not sure anyone has been able to track that. But I think as kind of this birthright citizenship, or like an effort to end birthright citizenship, these concerns about data protections related to FAFSA and U.S. citizen children filing it
FAFSA is the financial aid
yes.
form.
Submitting
It's the father of recent college students. I know
yes.
from that.
Oh, yeah, submitting FAFSA and including the information of their parents who may be undocumented. Those data concerns, the efforts to end birthright citizenship, that that had really massive ripple effects on the community, both students at CUNY and outside of CUNY, of whether they'd be able to continue to access these resources, even when their parents may be undocumented, so when their families are in mixed status families. So again, I can't speak to the numbers, but the fact that so many folks were concerned about whether U.S. citizen children with undocumented parents were able to fill out FAFSA or would be able to, whether they would be impacted by the end of birthright citizenship or future students would be impacted by it, I think demonstrates that it is a significant population that's concerned and impacted by it.
Good.
Well, and if I can say one thing more about that, I mean, the case you're referencing, Long K. Mark v. United States, right?
Yeah.
Asked and answer, there's never really been a legal debate about this. You know, it's kind of these fringe. John Eastman, one of the president's attorneys, is actually one of the lone people who's been trying to advance this theory for the last couple of decades. And this is, you know, crackpot stuff. There's already been legal action.
A lot of crackpot stuff that's now mainstream.
Sure, a federal
government.
judge,
Right,
a
right.
Reagan appointee, has already called this,
Right.
you know, stunningly unlawful. I can't remember the exact phrase that he
Yeah.
used, right? But, you know, I don't think this is going to proceed. I do want to make one point about the order itself, which is that it's kind of trying to skirt around, you know, it's more of a procedural thing, right? Stopping the government from issuing these certain types of, you know, identifications and
The Social Security
Social Security numbers for, you know, people born, by the way, not just to undocumented parents, but also parents with temporary status, which is something that doesn't get talked about much. But I think, you know, it's important just to kind of note that it also, there's nothing about the order that would make it retroactive. So even if it was sort of,
Yeah.
even if it did go into effect, which I really don't think it will, but even if it did, it would not affect anyone already born
here.
born, you know, in the United States. So that's just one point I think it's important to make when it.
Yeah, and that's the point that we need to emphasize. It cannot be retroactively enforced. You know, if they're trying to do this, they're going to have to do it for, you know, future births.
Well, because we all know that the Supreme Court would stand up to, well, no, I'm sorry. I didn't go there. Following up on what Cynthia was talking about, what do you advise students? Have people talked to you about this birthright citizenship, about their parents?
I think, no. That's because more of the students that we're focusing on are folks who are undocumented, who are on mixed status, and not more so the ones who, you know, their parents are undocumented, but they were born here.
I think Felipe brought up one of the latest ideas that came out in the last couple of days before we're taping this show, to require undocumented immigrants over the age of 14 to register, which, you know, to me is like a list of this is who we're going to deport. And has that had any effect? Has anybody brought that to your attention?
No, on our side, our attorneys just discussed this yesterday because it's not a policy yet. It's not even
Well, what are
on
they
USCIS.
saying? What are their concerns?
Well, the fact that it was from 9/11 and this did happen, and a lot of people who actively registered ended up in deportation proceedings, and whether or not what
and
advice
they're using the records through which they register.
Yeah, you say you want to do the right thing and you want to make sure that you're complying with this policy, and you're like, okay, the law, they're saying I should register. I'm going to register, and then no, guess what happens? You're in deportation proceedings because you've now given them your location, give them an updated name and an updated address so they know where you are, right? So advising on whether or not, you know, what risk is involved in doing this and whether or not you want to take that risk.
You know, the other policy that's just come that the president talked about in the last couple of days is, and I don't see why undocumented immigrants, including CUNY students, don't just take advantage of this. You can buy an entry visa for $5 million. I don't know why. I don't know why students wouldn't just do that. Can you buy an entry visa for $5 million?
Yeah, no, once I get that entry-level job.
Good response.
You know, I mean, some of this is absurd, but of course it's deadly serious. You know, it's what else should we be looking at in terms of, Felipe, you made the point in one of our earlier discussions that the fear may be greater than the capability of ICE to carry out what they're saying they want to carry out.
Yeah, I think, you know, I've written about this. A lot of this is about marketing, I think. You know, the reason that DHS Secretary Kristi Noem is showing up in the Bronx with, you know, a full blowout, you know, and an ice vest isn't because she's there to command the operation. It's because it's for TV.
Exactly.
And I think that they are relying essentially on a magnifying effect here of fear. I was reading some research from the Track Project at Syracuse, which has great data on immigration stuff, and it was basically finding that arrest and removal levels really have not increased very much over the last month, despite the fact that, this has been such a priority of the administration. And I think that speaks a little bit to just some capacity and logistical issues, right? They just are not able to, deport or arrest and deport 10 or 15 million people overnight. It's physically impossible. And so I think it relies a little bit on people feeling like they are sort of omnipresent, all-powerful when they really aren't, right? They really just don't.
They don't have the manpower.
They don't have the manpower. They don't really, frankly, have the
The money.
competence or or the money to do this properly, right? And I think that people should. There's a level of concern that we need to have, and that's why we're having this forum. But there's also, I think, a need to make sure that people understand that. You have to keep living your life. Sort of Rosa can talk a little bit about this, and she was saying so a little bit earlier, like people have to keep coming to school, right? The odds that you would be detained are not massively higher than they were a month ago.
But we
Exactly.
I think what I'm also I guess concerned about, because I think it is like a bad marketing scheme. And then I'm thinking of like the ASMR video that was released by DHS on their social media platforms. So I actually don't know what ASMR. What is ASMR stand
It's
for?
like sounds that are pleasing.
Yeah, so it's like
White
sounds that are
House
pleasing.
official
I don't know
Twitter.
what ASMR stands for, but they released a video. They titled it ASMR deportation proceedings, and so it was the sound of shackles. It was the sound of people being taken on planes and being forcibly deported. And so I think a lot of it is to like evoke this idea, this fear mongering of like we have more capacity than we really do. And then I think the other part of it is to invigorate a base that is interested in forcibly removing and violently removing people. And so that ASMR video is part of it. I think too, the Lincoln-Riley Act is another part of it, right? Is how do we deputize, even if it has no bite, right? How do we deputize people to make sure that they can participate in the mass deportation process? And I think that's what's concerning to me, considering how the election turned out, considering how we have upcoming midterm elections and what that will affect.
there have been instances around the country, I don't know if I've read it here, where parents are keeping their kids out of school. There are, talking about the fear. I'm wondering, is there a sense that people might not want to send their kids to places like CUNY? Because it is a public university, these are public records. Privacy is only as strong as the willingness of people to respect it. And do you get any sense that students may be either withdrawing or not thinking about going to a place like CUNY?
I don't think so. I think if anything, students are feeling empowered. I've seen a shift in at least the students that I've encountered and students that want to pursue careers in political science, go to law school and do something about it, not just sit and watch as policies are being signed or as the political climate of the country shifts towards uncertainty. I think more students want to be involved and are making a place for themselves within that.
Yeah, the days of we're in the shadows is like long gone. These students are more resilient than they were 10, 15 years ago. Students are showing up, and that's what we're telling them to do.
And that's why I think it's important for CUNY to also kind of to continue to support this population, because they are showing up, they are still enrolling, they are still participating, they're paying tuition dollars. And so what does it mean for CUNY to provide the resources, to provide the clarity so that folks feel safe engaging with the university system?
Let me take a question. How are you? Tell us your first name and your campus.
Hi, my name is Veronica. I'm from CUNY School of Law. I graduated Brooklyn College last
I'm a Brooklyn
spring.
College boy, so good.
Nice.
So we're good for you.
My question is, many immigrant students, they live in this legal limbo for years and decades on whether it's administrative delays or other reasons. I've experienced that myself, and they live in this fear, constant checking for updates or new policies. How could CUNY students, including immigrant students, how could they take a more direct approach in impacting these policies, if that's possible? Because oftentimes these policies don't take any input from people they impact. How could they take a more direct advocacy on that, or how could they feel more comfortable? What can we do. Are there any specific resources that we can reach, or any specific things that we could do to feel a bit more at peace at CUNY campuses?
Yeah, I hate to be the doom and gloom. One of the panel is that we know that the delays that students are seeing right now, they're going to be compounded over the next couple of months, and it's going to be bad. What we need to be doing as individuals or New York City residents is the elected officials. You have to show up to them because they're the ones that can do something about this. You know, Trump has already said that they're going to do everything in their power to make sure that, you know, the processing timelines are longer than they already are.
What I'll add to that too is I think like a purpose of kind of stifling us with all of these horrible legislation efforts is to also make sure that folks feel isolated in the process of wanting to commune with one another and find resources. So I think it is in building community. It's in connecting with organizations that, like Monique has said, have already been doing this work for years, even during the first Trump's administration. And so I think it's finding community, and building a sense of confidence through those spaces to then advocate and do more.
And if I can add one thing, I think people tend to think of immigration policy being exclusively federal, which, I mean, it is when we're talking about enforcement and things like that. But a lot of the difference that gets made is at the local level where, you know, for example, right now we have New York City Mayor Eric Adams talking about, you know, potentially a higher level of cooperation with immigration enforcement. And so I would make sure also to be kind of present for local political discussions and not just think about this as a federal issue.
Well, that's also because going back to Mayor Ed Koch, who came up with the first order that said New York City agencies will not cooperate with immigration authorities whether it's in a hospital, whether it's the police. I mean, the argument was, if you get an undocumented immigrant with a communicable disease, you want that person to go seek care in a hospital because that affects all of us. If an undocumented person is a victim of a crime, you want that person to feel safe going to the police department because that affects all of us. And so, and that's why Eric Adams, and to Mayor Adams' credit, he has said he is talking about cooperating with the deportation of undocumented immigrants who have been convicted of crimes. I don't think he said charged with crimes. I think he said, convicted of crimes. And to some degree, that's always been the policy. Isn't that correct?
There's a list of, crimes under which, I think it's 170, I can't remember exactly, but, that already in New York City law, if a person has been convicted of one of those crimes and, ICE presents a judicial warrant, which they almost never do, then there will be some level of cooperation or they'll honor a detainer. But that happened 0 times last year.
That's right.
So it's pretty rare, I would say.
Well, with the mayor, this is also mixed up with the so-called quid pro quo that they drop charges, provided he cooperates, and that they could conceivably bring back those criminal charges. It's a mess. It's something we've never seen in all of our years. Let me take a question. I believe this is from a Hunter student. Do you have an idea of the scope to which these AOP future policies will affect students at CUNY? Do you know what I'm sorry, I don't know what AOP is. Well, how these policies would affect the future of CUNY students. Should we expect, the way we saw some parents keeping their kids out of school, that people will be discouraged, will go back into the shadows?
I don't think so. I'm an immigrant myself.
Where are you from?
Antigua.
Okay.
And I do not see this group of students going back to, being in the shadows and not coming out to school. I don't see that as a thing. Call me naive, but.
I'd like to chime in. So throughout the work that I've been doing with Dr. Carvajal's Office of Undocumented Immigrant Students Programs at CUNY, I'm graduating in 2025, so students who graduated before me had the possibility of applying to and being granted protection under DACA, which Felipe touched upon earlier. However, students younger than me would not have been eligible to apply or even be granted protection under DACA. So we're increasingly seeing the demographic of immigrant students be undocumented. So these are students that have had to navigate systems of applying to college, of having to do contracting work instead of employment opportunities to generate income. So this is a student population that is used to kind of jumping through hurdles, finding the loopholes, and doing what they can to survive. So I don't see a future in which we see these students backing into the shadows, but I do see in the foreseeable future maybe protests, maybe I don't know, petitions, litigation to change policies at the state level to service this population that we are seeing surface at an increasing level.
I think
Yeah.
I'm also interested in, we talk a lot about the students, right? Like, are they going back in the shadows? What are they doing? And then I'm also thinking, like, how do we make sure that staff and faculty who have been supporting this population, the universities who have put funds and support systems in place to make sure that these students are being integrated into the university system, that those efforts don't go back into the shadows, right? Because there is a lot of threats to, like, we'll take away federal funds if you're not doing like X, Y, and Z. And that is, in some instances, universities are being, they feel like their hand is being forced as to what they can and cannot provide to a specific population in order to acquiesce to that, that strong arming. But I think it's also really important that university systems, staff and faculty remain and keep that support and that momentum going so that students feel like they can interact with the university, they can enroll and attend at these campuses.
Yes.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Nidisha Hall from Edgar Evers College. My question is, how does CUNY advocate for undocumented students in light of changing immigration policies, and what resources and available to the students to help navigate legal and financial challenges?
What kinds of resources are available? That's an excellent question. Yes.
We have a whole department.
We do have a whole department. So I'm, with my position as the University Director for Undocumented Immigrant Student Programs, it was a department that was created by the direction of Chancellor Matos Rodriguez and VC Maybank as a result of wanting to support undocumented students in a more systematized way. And so I lead these efforts, and what that means is that I work with the universities to make sure that they are providing accurate guidance to their students so that they can access financial aid, in-state tuition, other types of resources. But I think aside from my office, which is which is an effort that we're continuing to put more resources to, there are also immigrant student success centers across CUNY. And so at 4 of our campuses, John Jay being the first, where I was the inaugural director of as well, Brooklyn College, Hunter College, and City College are all campuses that have immigrant student success centers. And so these are full-time staff that are content experts and providing resources for this particular population. Aside from these 4 campuses, we have 3 universities, Queens College, Gutman Community College, and Baruch College, that have immigrant student success initiatives. And like Rosa said, it's not, the individuals who staff these initiatives, they're not full-time doing this work. They have other responsibilities, and then they are kind of really passionate about this and are putting a lot of effort into it. But for the other campuses that I didn't name, so out of our 25, 7 of our campuses have these types of resources. For the remaining campuses, there are immigrant student success liaisons at each of those spaces. And so these liaisons attend meetings with me once a month, receive resources, trainings, in order to make sure that everyone is on the same page as to how undocumented students can be supported and what are some resources to provide. But of course, still a lot more that we can be doing, and we're working towards that.
Yeah, and Citizenship Now has been around now for 28 years. We provide free immigration legal services to CUNY students, faculty, and staff.
Now, just to be very practical here, I am an undocumented student, whether I'm on campus or I'm off campus, and I am approached by somebody wearing an ICE shirt. I will say that there was an incident, I believe, at Temple University, where 2 guys masquerading as ICE people started harassing students, and they wound up getting arrested. So, I suspect because of some of the craziness on the right wing that people are kind of trying to take the law into their own hands in this case. But let's assume you are approached. You're at a party, you're at a college event, you're at something, even if you're off campus. What do you do?
So right now, if you are on a CUNY campus, we have provided guidance to the university system Public safety should be contacted, and then the Office of the General Counsel should be contacted. First, we want to know, does that officer have an actual warrant to actually identify who the student is? And if that's not there, then they should be dismissed and sent away.
Why would they get a warrant? Would that warrant be for a criminal matter? What would that warrant be for?
For anything. But the thing is what Felipe said. ICE officers typically do not have a judicial warrant. They have this DHS paper that says, you know, they have an order to find this person. Unless it is a judicial warrant that is signed by a federal judge, they should not be granted access to your campus or any space. If you're at home, they should not be, you should not even open the door to them.
So is there any other advice you would have?
Yeah, I mean, like, don't say anything. I would be my primary, like, you know, unless you are compelled by subpoena or warrant to sort of be detained or give information, like, there's no requirement to talk to any law enforcement.
Right.
You know, I mean, the police or ICE or the FBI or ATF or anybody, unless you're compelled to by a judicial warrant or something similar, or a subpoena. And so, you know, like, don't be helpful. I mean, you don't have to be. There's no benefit to anybody from you running your mouth, just to be very frank. And so, you know, I would advise anyone, you know, by the way, not just talking about immigrant students here, you know, U.S. citizen students, legal permanent resident students, F1 students, whatever, don't say anything. There's no need to. You know, there's no benefit to be had, right? And, you know, I think there's a kind of a social thing about feeling helpful, or it's awkward to be like, no.
Well, it's also intimidating. It's not
Yeah,
just
exactly.
awkward, it's
Certainly.
also intimidating.
Yeah, but you know, you're allowed to not say anything, and you shouldn't. I mean, I think it was just kind of another thing to point out.
There's almost so have students talked to you about any interaction with ICE, or you have not had any of your fellow students talk about
anyone
interaction
who has
with ICE?
personally interacted with ICE. There has been sightings at subway stations, Grand Central, of things of that nature, but I don't know anyone who has individually been detained or questioned, stopped and frisked, anything of that nature.
There was an incident up at Columbia University, one of the science centers, where some of the students, a couple of students, were stopped on their way in by people who said they were ICE. I assume they were wearing ICE stuff, but they just kind of walked on by, kind of, you know, consistent with what you're saying.
Yeah, if I could make just also a plea for people in general, like, there's a lot of stuff going around on TikTok and on
exactly.
Instagram and on Twitter. Oh, ICE is cited here. There's an ICE checkpoint here. And a lot of the times that's just, it's not
calm
true.
down.
People like saw something that they misinterpreted, right? Unless you have confirmed that
Yes.
something is happening, it really does more harm than good
Yeah,
to
do
just
not
start
share
spreading
it.
information, you know, that might not be true. And then everyone's scared, you know, so just kind of, you know, one thing to note that again, with the fear thing, right? Like, you don't want to do their marketing for them. You know, confirm that something is happening before you start sort of like spreading it around.
No, and that's one of the things that we're monitoring. We're trying to verify if anyone says that, you know, ICE was spotted somewhere near or at a CUNY campus. We're like on this to make sure that was it really ICE, or was it like some mysterious black truck that was sitting somewhere that's, you know, going to cause fear in, you know, students coming to campus.
There's also a report. You know, news is coming very fast, you know, on all kinds of fronts with the Trump administration, but particularly with immigration, that they're about to contract with a private prison firm in Newark, New Jersey, to open up a 1,000-bed facility so they can hold that many more people. So there is planning going on. And a significant number of the people who are being held are not people who have been convicted of crimes.
Exactly.
Is that correct?
Well, there's a lot. I mean, not to get too into the weeds, but, you know, ICE detains people in county jails, in private detention spaces, and it's been doing that for a long time. And there are a few federal facilities. You know, I wouldn't necessarily say that the presence itself of a new detention center is necessarily going to mean that they're going to like detain that many more people or anything like that. We actually used to have ICE detention
But are they?
in Hudson County.
My question is slightly different. Is that are the detainees all people who fall under the convicted criminal, or are there?
No.
Rarely.
Really?
I mean, you know, like we have there are federal prisons called CAR prisons that are like exclusively for people who are convicted of federal crimes that are non-citizens. But in civil ICE detention, which by the way is supposed to be non-punitive, although it isn't functionally non-punitive, there's no like distinction. Like, there's not like ICE detention for people who are convicted of crimes and ICE detention for people who aren't. Everyone just gets put in the same place. And most of the people from what we've seen lately that are getting picked up in the last couple of weeks are not people who have been convicted of anything.
Any crime.
And the reason for that is because they're the lowest hanging fruit, right? Like ICE is going after people who are known already to them in many cases and who are not attempting to evade sort of the authorities, because they want to beef up their detention numbers. And so they're actually doing almost the inverse of what the sort of public pronouncement is, which is that they're going after the worst of the worst and criminals and whatever. They're doing kind of the mirror image of that, in terms of going after people who are sort of living in the community because those are the easiest people to arrest,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and the going to Home Depot, going to all of these places where they know local immigrants are hanging out is not the criminals that they're targeting. They just want to meet these target numbers to get this, splashy, this is what we did in the first 100 days. So,
It's also the case, though, that because so much of our economy and the national economy depends on undocumented workers, whether it's, farm work in upstate New York and out west, whether it's meatpacking plants in Iowa, Republican state, they somehow have not gone after the meatpacking plants in Iowa. The Deliverista community here in New York City is, I would think is largely undocumented and live in fear of checkpoints. The NYPD has been doing and some enforcement actions, not immigration actions, just enforcement actions, because some of the deliveristas will drive way too fast on city streets. And there's a move to require registration of bikes and registration of deliveristas. And again, it's creating records that causes people concern. It's the idea of being required to register everybody over 14. Providing a record makes it easier if things go really bad and they just decide to, go the Japanese internment route of World War II and just pick up everybody. So, this idea of, is there any sense of, concerns over the record keeping?
Yeah, there are, but I still harp on this point that I do not think they have the resources to pick everybody up, right? And I'm backing you up on this one, Felipe. Where's the money going to come from?
From the detention
The
center.
Oh, I thought you were going to say the $5 million green cards.
No, from the detention center, right? That's a massive.
It's a massive industry.
Yeah, and a lot of folks. I won't get into it, but
Well,
I
they
think
paid a lot of money to open up Guantanamo Bay, and they had to close it down because they couldn't afford it. So
yeah.
But it's I've always believed that this record keeping is being pushed for a reason.
Yeah, well, look, we have, as I think somebody made the point earlier, we have state laws that prevent information sharing.
Provided they can withstand federal overreach.
Well, now we're getting into whether federalism will continue. I don't think we need to go there.
It's a pretty big question for them.
Right. Look, if things if our constitutional system holds, then the federal laws and the state laws that prevent that information sharing will stand. If we no longer live in a constitutional system, then that's a different ballgame, and we can't really talk about what happens then. But for now, right? The city has laws, the state has laws that specifically prevent the type of information sharing that would be of the most concern, right? Which is actually something that the state is getting sued over, the green light law.
Yeah.
Where Attorney General Pam Bondi, the former illustrious Attorney General of Florida, is suing New York over the driver's license law for
Those records,
for the records, because that's exactly what they want. They want the records to be able to use them for enforcement. But there is a very clear firewall, even at the federal level. For example, IRS records cannot be used for purposes other than taxation, right, under federal law. Now, they're probably going to want to change that, and I think that's a real concern. But there are laws that are in place to prevent this kind of thing from happening. And if it does happen, there will be litigation. Obviously, you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube, but, assuming that we will have laws in a month, there are laws that interact with this kind of record question.
I think that's why, like, the education component, not necessarily university-wise, but I mean, just making sure that people know their rights, know what legislation is in place, know that, like, compliance isn't a way to be protected from this, right? That's how we can make sure that these efforts are done in vain. So if we keep coming back to like the registry, right, and people having to register, I think what's like the biggest concern about that request is that some folks may feel like, well, I need to comply because that'll protect me. That'll protect me from like the quote unquote bad immigrants that aren't complying. But just like we saw after 9/11, that wasn't the case. Everyone, like a good portion of folks who were registered were deported. And so as long as we're educating folks and letting people know you have rights, these are ways in which you don't have to comply, like constitutionally you're not required to. We can make sure that people are protected and none of these efforts are actually met.
What should CUNY students, particularly undocumented students, but the broader community of immigrant students, what should they know? I mean, we have some information that we're putting up on the screen about where you can find information, where you can find, in essence, a cheat sheet that says what you can and what should they know?
Well, for us, we're trying to make sure that every student has a thorough analysis of their immigration history. Are you eligible for something that you did not know about, whether or not it's SIJ or a U visa, a T visa, asylum, anything that you are eligible to apply for it, making sure that they're applying for it right now. We're still encouraging folks who are on some of these other
When you say applying, you're talking about
submitted an application.
CUNY benefits.
No, immigration benefits. So if you're eligible for SIJ, if you're eligible
what is that?
Special Immigrant Juvenile Status. Yes. If you're eligible for any form of relief, now is the time to make sure that you're sitting down with an attorney and going over your history, your
And
immigration
there are free
history.
attorneys that do that.
Yes, it's all free. And it's not just at CUNY. There are a number of city funded entities and state-funded entities that are providing these consultations. So going through your immigration history, your parents' immigration history to see if there's any old application that was put in for you, those are the types of things that you need to be doing right now.
What would you be telling your undocumented? So just building on that, is there anything else that they're, very practical? How do they find out what they can do, what they should not do?
I think it's either and I'm not going to talk about kind of the federal or immigration level. I think I'm going to talk about the educational component of it. But I think making sure to connect either with our office, so at cuny.edu/immigrant, and even if they're attending a very specific campus, connecting with the individual at that campus to make sure that they are accessing all the benefits that they could have access to, whether that's in-state tuition, whether it's the New York State DREAM Act and accessing state aid, whether it's privately funded scholarships, whether it's educational experiential opportunities that can provide them a fellowship with a stipend. We want to make sure that students know that these things are available to them. There are people who can answer those questions. But I think one of the caveats that I mentioned to students is because these efforts to support undocumented students are relatively new to to CUNY's history. If a question is asked to one staff member and that staff member says, no, you can't access it, the important part is to ask another person. Because sometimes staff are still being trained, they're still being informed about these state benefits. And so someone may incorrectly answer, and it happens. People give incorrect information. And so we want to make sure they're asking additional people, other people, a third person, to make sure that they're accessing those resources.
Is there a comparable undocumented immigrant students programs at SUNY, at other colleges?
No. So actually, I get a lot of emails from VPs, presidents, at staff members at SUNY colleges, at private universities as well, because CUNY has this centralized department without a SUNY counterpart or without a private school counterpart. And so they're often emailing me requesting trainings and information, guidance on what they can do, not just for like one-off trainings, but also how can they establish similar centers, similar offices, similar centralized departments.
Do you have any idea what the population at SUNY would be?
No,
I have no idea.
I don't have a sense of it, but I think what I will share is recently 3 SUNY campuses have partnered with the Dream US Scholarship. So the Dream US Scholarship is a nationwide scholarship that covers, it's known as kind of like the Pell Grant for undocumented students. It covers tuition fully, provides them with a substantial stipend every semester and additional supports. And so all of our CUNY campuses partner with them. All of our undergraduate CUNY campuses partner with the Dream US.
Because clearly, undocumented immigrants is not solely a New York City phenomenon when it comes to New York State.
Right. And so 3 SUNY many campuses are partnering with the Dream US Scholarship, and they have a substantial, I think over 100 each of those 3 campuses of scholars that are participating in that program. And what I'll share is our Dream US population, compared to the larger undocumented student population, is only about 2 to 5% of our students. And so if that can be compared to SUNY, we can expect there to be quite a bit more undocumented students across their campuses.
Rosa was talking about how, students who she's graduating in 25, that students before her were able to at least apply for DACA. Students after her are not going to be able to do that. I mean, I think this is really a crazy system to have to live under in order to try to. I also know that when my grandparents came in 1900 and 1905, all they had to do was pass a health test at Ellis Island, and they were put on a boat to Lower Manhattan and registered in the Democratic Party, and they could not get in today. So, this is, it doesn't take a great deal of a sense of history for me to see that. And, I guess a lot of people don't. And I also, just a total side thing, I represent in my real life, the American Indian Law Alliance, represents indigenous nations around the country who have a wonderful mug that points out that they've been fighting illegal immigration since 1492. So, I guess it's all a matter of your perspective. Are things going to get worse?
Yes, unfortunately. There are a lot of things on the horizon, right? Litigation is wild right now. I mean, we saw, a judge now has reversed or paused the administration's attempt to shut down the refugee program. We're probably going to see a Title 42 type thing to shut down immigration based on measles, which, by the way, is being ignored domestically. We could have a whole conversation about that. The military thing, I think, was a big concern sort of around the time of the inauguration. We haven't really seen as much of an issue, like how that's going to play out, but I think that's something on the radar to be kind of concerned about, the deployments along the border. I mean, there are all sorts of things. The problem, I think, is you have a guy like Stephen Miller who wakes up every day bright and early to figure out, how to screw immigrants, right? And this guy's a single-minded person, he knows
in
a
the
lot
White
about
House, he's a
and there's this whole system of intellectual underpinning to the anti-immigrant movement, FAIR, Numbers USA, the, various think tanks. And so we have a lot of people who are very dedicated to this project, and they're going to keep rolling stuff out, kind of similar to the Trump Term 1 agenda, except supercharged because they've had more time to think about it. And so I think we're...
Also because they had appointees who were not as disconnected to the norms of government. There were people who stopped some of the worst instincts that were coming out of the White House. I'm not sure those people exist today.
Yeah, look, we have HHS, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., we have DOJ, Pam Bondi, right? And we have DHS, Christina Noem. All these people are loyalists,
and Mr. Homan,
right,
Honan
kind of
ICE. Right.
So anyway, to answer your question, yes, I think things are going to get worse. Just in terms of the sheer amount of the number of policies and sort of their cumulative impact. I will say though that that doesn't mean it's time to throw in the towel. I mean, the litigation to some extent has already been successful, with birthright citizenship, with the refugee program, and it's going to kind of be that tit for tat again, as it was back then, and so it's time, I think, also to sort of organize, as we were talking about earlier. I think a lot of people are like, well, this is overwhelming. What can I do? I think what people can do is kind of keep the pressure on, right? A lot of the things during the first Trump term that got rolled back were not necessarily because of litigation, but because of public pressure. I mean, most infamously, we had the family separation thing, which they caved on in 4 days because there was such an outcry. And so I think with things like that, people need to be paying attention and sort of, figuring out how to be vocal and loud and sort of push back.
Let me ask you, do you get a sense of students organizing, any kind of organized protests? Again, or are they still in a state of shock? When I was at Brooklyn College in the late 1960s, it was the Vietnam War. We protested everything, and I also knew everything that needed to be known, but now I know how little I knew then. Is there a sense of an organized resistance growing? Do you feel it? Do you see it?
I sense that there's still the feeling of shock and overwhelmingly, I don't want to say hiding in the shadows because there's students are showing up, but I wouldn't say that students feel confident enough in coming forward or in outing themselves as aligning with a cause and then being labeled or being identified as undocumented, even if they are not. I think students are practicing self-preservation right now and not organizing in masses.
Well, one of the things that we discussed in preparing for this show is not to have any students, expose any students' immigration status. That was not, we're not going to give individual legal advice. We're not going to, but we were very sensitive to that. But New York. I mean, so students are coming out and saying, "I'm undocumented." Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that they are not.
So they are not. So there is. So there is that. I mean, is there any sense
I think
that
there is
that
a lot
you're-
of quiet resistance right now. There's a lot of quiet resistance happening behind closed doors. I know different campuses are having student meetings, but for example, they're not posting the room number online. They are only disclosing the location of meetings to members in group chats or people who they feel safe enough to be in the same room with. So it's not that students aren't organizing, it's just it's not public facing yet.
I think the importance is that you have to fight for the country and that, immigration is the story of this country.
Now,
And-
just to touch on this one,
Yes.
is like every immigrant student is impacted. It's not just undocumented students. Every immigrant student is going to feel some effect from these policies. And, if you're going to say, we're just going to focus on, we need to focus on every single immigrant student and not set aside, undocumented or green card.
segment them.
Not segmented. United
Okay.
we stand.
Let me say thank you all. We'll see you next time. I'm already over my time. Thank you. We'll see you next time on CUNY Forum. Thank you, and good luck.